all CEOs, me included, we don't actually know what we're doing.
They're all sharks, so all you got to do, though, is know shark behavior.
I don't think we've ever talked about this before.
We can capture all of the wallet share.
First place you start is with the product.
That's just the first note.
This is the Capital Stack.
Hey everybody, this is David Paul, the host of the Capital Stack podcast, where I talk to founders, operators, and investors about all things value creation in startups. Today, I am speaking to the founder and CEO of Phantom Space, Jim Cantrell. Jim is a lifelong space executive. He was the CEO of, what was it? Vector Space. I was going to say Barta, but it wasn't Barta. It was Vector. Following that, he was also members of Strat Space, Vintage Exotic, Competition of Engineering, as well as the managing partner at Wolverine Capital. Jim was also the first vice president of business development over at SpaceX, was on one of the founding team, and he knows about all things space, and that's what we were talking about today. Jim, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Good to be here, David.
You kind of look like a evil supervillain with like the black chair and the black outfit right now.
That pretty much captures it. Yeah, evil supervillain. Yeah. Yeah. All entrepreneurs wear black, so do mechanics. So part of it is for either one of those applications. I was working on my truck this morning.
And you're building like a missile that's in like a mountain in a secret layer.
Right, exactly, yeah. We're a submarine. You can't see what we're doing.
Exactly. Jim, you're doing something pretty incredible right now. You're also an author of a book called Breaking All the Rules, which highlights the space race that was really prolific in 2021 between Elon, Bezos, and Branson. What's going on in the space industry today? From your perspective, I would say going up into 2021, and then what's going on now, and how do you see it going forward?
Yeah, so let me give a sort of historical perspective. So when Germany surrendered to the United States after World War II, the United States had an immense amount of scientific discovery that they found. Weapon systems the Germans had built that were amazing that we had no idea about, and things we did know about. And so that really, that demobilization after World War II continued in a small way. A lot of the car factories went back to building cars. The washing machine factories quit building bombs, made washing machines again. But there was a certain portion of the industry that remained intact, and that portion of the industry became what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And they built weapon systems really to defeat the Soviets and protect us from that for decades. And the space program was born out of that. It was a competition with the Soviet Union. It was communism versus capitalism on the world stage. And it was a national priority unlike any other. And that really culminated in the Apollo lunar landing in 1969, when two astronauts stepped on the moon for the first time ever in human history. So very much a turning point in history. I was a young boy at that time. It's part of what inspired me to get into space. But what's happened since then is you had this malaise era that followed. We gave up going to the moon for various reasons. Built a shuttle that was a magnificent machine, but it was a trip to nowhere, just lunar orbit. And the promise of Apollo was really unfulfilled. The promise of Apollo was really that we would be going to Mars, we would be colonizing the moon. If you watch, Stanley Kubrick's 2001: Space Odyssey, that's how we really saw the future back then, and a lot of us believed that, and we're very disappointed when the U.S. government, didn't follow through on that, and through no real fault of their own. There's a lot of reasons, Vietnam and a lot of economic conditions that prevented that from happening. There was a whole generation of people that were frustrated with this, and so. This is what I call the space revolutionaries. A lot of us just said, look, we tried to go work for NASA. They're not doing anything. Big companies aren't doing anything. We want to do something, so we're just going to do it ourselves. And so that created this revolutionary spirit. There was a small number, but very dedicated number of people from the space industry that were just looking for something to go forward with. And Elon Musk turned out to be that answer back in 2001. I personally got involved with the Russian space program as well as the French, because they were flying to Mars and nobody else was. And, by the time Elon came along, he didn't walk into a vacuum and create what SpaceX is today. He walked into a very fertile field, planted more seeds with his money and his entrepreneurial spirit, and that's what started SpaceX. And his idea started really as an idea of sending a plant growth chamber to Mars and trying to inspire humanity. It turned out that he found out the better thing was to just build the infrastructure to go to Mars, and that's what SpaceX is about today. So what you've seen happen is there were several waves of things. You saw the billionaires come in. Elon was the leading billionaire there. There were others that came before him. Andrew Beal, for example, he started and failed. He was a billionaire banker out of Texas. And then Jeff Bezos, about the same time as SpaceX started into this. And so that billionaire-fueled space company then made space safe for investment. And prior to this, most commercial space was done on debt deals. There were big geostationary satellites, not the kind of thing we're seeing today, which is a very dynamic entrepreneurial kind of environment. SpaceX did that, really. And there were a couple of successes like Skybox Imaging, which I was part of. We built spy satellites for $1 million instead of $1 billion, sold that to Google for $500 million. All these things came together and made space the place to put, high risk, deep tech investments. And so you saw that play out over a number of years, a decade, in fact, and it culminated, I think, at its peak in about 2021. And you mentioned that in your intro, that was when there was, probably the highest amount of investment that's come into this business since I've been around it. And what this has done is it's fueled the smaller and smaller satellites that have come along. So they've also drawn on the broader, development of micro technologies, what's in our cell phones, what's in our computers. So the cost and the size of all these satellites have come down. The price of launch has come down. So it's this proliferation, kind of like computers were when I was in the university in the 80s, right? They were just new on the market, the personal computer, and that's what space has done. And so today, what you see is the result of a couple of bad years of economics. Blame it on what you like, but the markets are tough right now. So we're going to see a culling over the next year or two of a lot of these space companies that gorged themselves on investor money and weren't very good stewards of it. And we'll see some bankruptcies. We'll see some flushing out. We'll see a lot of people prognosticating that the end of space is here. But it won't be, because this is the new frontier. This is what the new world was to the Spaniards 500 years ago, right? If you were standing on the shores of Spain and looking, you would say, oh, well, that's nice. They're bringing back loads of gold, but, what are we going to do with all that land? Well, nobody could imagine. Nobody's smart enough to imagine 500 years later what would be created here. You and I sit in Arizona. They didn't know about Arizona. They didn't know what was out here. And the same is true of the space economy and the new frontier in space, and we will conquer it. And in 500 years, nobody on this earth knows what it's going to be.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. I mean, we look at it as the new frontier, but as our infinite selves can view it, this might be the last frontier or the final frontier.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, we're not smart enough to know that, right? And this gets a little metaphysical, but how would we travel to the stars? The closest star, I think, is like 24 light years away. That means if you're light, it takes you 24 years to get there. It's just not practical. We don't understand physics in a sense that Einstein described it as time wraps around. Maybe there are such things as wormholes that we can travel through, right? And in 500 years, maybe we'll have understood that and be able to manipulate it. We just don't know. I mean, you go back 1,000 years to when the Vikings were first coming to North America, they had no idea, and if you told them about nuclear energy and nuclear bombs, probably got burned at the stake. And so the same thing is true when you start talking about this being the final frontier. We just don't know where it all goes. There may be frontiers within the frontier.
And so how does space exploration, space tech, deep tech, how does that also kind of weave into defense tech? Because I feel like those are two very, tightly conjoined industries.
Yeah, they're very related, as it turns out. I spent many years doing defense work, classified space warfare stuff. And, part of what we're doing at Phantom is to develop capabilities that help save the military from themselves. I mentioned, that the military-industrial complex rose and is still around, and they're very inefficient at building innovative new things, and that's just a fact. And if you're a CEO of one of the big three companies, you can hate me all you want, but it's a fact. And so the smaller, more agile commercial startups are the ones that are going to develop the new technology that will become dual use for our military. Skybox, I mentioned earlier, is a prime example. It's now part of Planet. And if you watch the news, a lot of the imagery, overhead imagery you see comes from Planet. Comes from that stuff we did, 15 years ago, right after SpaceX started. So you'll see this more and more happen. And I think it, just in terms of philosophy, this is the rightful role of government, which is to be mission oriented. The government, in my thinking, has no business being in the part of manufacturing launch vehicles and satellites and things like that. So, NASA, for example, I always joke that they'd make an iPhone and sell it if they thought they'd get away with it because it supports their job base. But thankfully, they're not very efficient at that sort of thing. So, living in a market economy, gradually these things work themselves out, and it's not. So I view it not only as a patriotic thing to do, but it's a good financial thing to do, being in the startup space.
What's more patriotic than watching your country launch a rocket?
Yeah, watching your country do the right thing, I would say.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, watching a rocket's it's almost a religious experience, and until you've experienced it, it's hard to believe, but it is. It's so much power being released, in such a short period of time that it's overwhelming, right? And I can remember being brought to tears a couple of times watching these big rockets take off, and I still am captivated by it.
So, taking a history lesson, going back to the kind of the space race, the tensions between the United States and China, the United States and Russia, capitalism versus communism. Was this just a general insecurity that these governments had, and they just forced themselves to start doing that? Were there back channel conversations about the directives of these like moon landings? I mean, how did they just look at it as a barometer for their own research and development success? As can we land on the moon, or was there something tied to a greater outcome for that?
Well, I think it's a very complex issue. It's a great question you ask. I go back to, again, Germany, and if you look at their Me-262, which was the first real operational jet fighter, and they produced any significant numbers, had they deployed those years earlier, which they could have if they had made different decisions, the outcome of the war might have been different. So people in that war began to understand the importance of technology as an outcome of our very national security. And you don't have to look very far today. I mean, I know Iron Dome didn't work against the 5,000 Hamas missiles that came across, but that has protected Israeli citizens for years and years and years. So there's definitely a tie between national security and our technological prowess. So there's always that in the back of everybody's minds, and it's hard for a lot of people, particularly younger people, to understand that the Soviet Union meant us harm, and they were not our friend. They were a communist system, which the goal of communism, stated goal of communism, was to destroy the bourgeois and the capitalists, right? And they were coming to take our lunch away and to take our homes away and tell us what to do. And so this was an existential fear on the part of everyone. I experienced it myself. I'm 58 years old, and I grew up under the Soviet threat. So it was very, very, very real. And when the Soviets were actually the first people to put a man in space, that had real implications, right? So a person probably doesn't weigh as much as a nuclear warhead, but it wasn't very far to extrapolate the ability to put multiple nuclear warheads on a rocket and place it in your backyard. And that became personal to each and every one in this country. And this country's not been since 1812 that we've had foreign troops on the lower 48 states, right? So it's largely forgotten. The Civil War is forgotten, and these foreign wars we've experienced have had very, very little, if any, impact on directly on people living here. So this is something that motivated people. And what you also saw on top of this was this sense of competition, and there was a sense that, and it still is out there, that we had to show the world that capitalism was better and stronger and a better system than communism. And, if you go back into post-World War II, Italy almost became communist. Greece almost became communist. There was a great sentiment of wanting to be taken care of. And, of course, this is what the communists tell you. They just don't tell you that they're going to destroy your life afterwards. So there was a great sense, particularly in the early 60s, of having to combat that worldwide. So call it propaganda, whatever you want to call it. It was a very real feeling. That all fueled the initial NASA and the initial moon program. And that was a great motivator, and we got it done.
And so after, I guess the world went in peacetime, quote unquote peacetime, a lot of these space projects were shelved, and people like you and other, they said, what happened, right? We were going to do all these great things. You moved to Europe. You started to work with, different types of foreign nationalists working on different types of space programs. And now we're not so much in a peaceful world anymore. Right, and we have private enterprise working on projects that have far surpassed anything the government's been able to manufacture, and probably far beyond what the primes, right, are being able to manufacture or innovate towards. So where do we sit now from a value chain on funding, government dollars, for national security, away from the primes and into earlier stage companies that are more innovative? How hard is that? And are they more open than they used to be?
Yeah, another good question. So my view of the primes, and they won't necessarily subscribe to my view of them, but I think the geopolitical and economic forces will place them there, is they're really extensions of the government and are becoming more and more mission oriented. So what startups aren't good at, for example, is what the big primes are, which is integration of mission. And so when you get involved with national security type things, there are clearances, right? And those are long lead items, and it's overhead, it's expensive to maintain, and so on. So you've got to have the right people that have the talent and are able to be cleared, and were basically angels when they were young. They have to have tools that understand the whole system is how it plays out, right? You can't just build a rocket to shoot a rocket down. You have to understand how this fits into a system of systems. That's what the primes are good at. They're becoming less and less good as they've grown to, it's like being married to somebody. You become more and more like your spouse after years and years of living with them. Same is true of, these primes in the government. They start to look and act more like the government, which has got its right role. And if the government's mission-oriented, so will the primes. So then the value chain becomes really a supply chain kind of proposition, which it ought to be in a capitalist system anyhow. If we can provide the products at a lower level that they integrate into the mission-oriented type things for defense, then that's a better deal for the taxpayer. It's a better deal for society, and we're going to be more effective at defending ourselves. So that's really where it's going. And even at our level at Phantom Space, we're sort of, I would call it a mid-tier integrator, where we build our launch vehicles. We don't build all the parts ourselves, unlike SpaceX. We build satellites, same thing. We build some of them, we don't build some of them, we buy it. And so there's always going to be that lower level of suppliers that's always critical. And if you don't have those, for example, you have supply chain security. So the DoD has an issue with foreign suppliers, and so we stick to all U.S. suppliers because of supply chain security. There is sabotage that occurs on our supply chain from a defense point of view. So it's a very complicated issue that I don't know if I feel fortunate, but I've lived through all these things over the last 35 years, and at least kind of can see where this is all going. But it's a more complicated world than it was 30 years ago by far. I was just talking to somebody this morning that sometimes I wish for the old Soviet times when it was, you could, when I was a kid, you could, go around the neighborhood when your parents were at work, and you just had to tell them where you're going. They didn't worry about them. And now, you worry about your kids getting, molested and kidnapped.
Totally, yeah. I mean,
it's just a different world completely. And internationally, it's the same thing, right? Am I going to get killed at this concert? It's not something people think about.
Mm-hmm. And so if I get this correct, so basically the gateways to government dollars in at least the immediate term is entrenched with the primes, but companies like Phantom, companies that have scale, will now be layered in their supply chain, in order to be able to get products out quicker, right? As opposed to you trying to go directly to the government and unlock those processes.
Well, in some cases, we do. So Phantom has a $300 million NASA contract for launch services. We have several proposals into the DoD for launch services. The primes are talking to us about satellite supply. So it just depends on the product, and the government will go direct for some things and indirect for others.
And so when you're building a company like this, where you're getting these contracts, you have essentially these lead times and these opportunities. How do you think of, as a startup founder who's been scrappy and has been very capital efficient, what opportunities you go after? You can't do everything.
Right.
What are the milestones you need to unlock? Additional capital.
So yeah, it's a great question again, and we have a strategy that's focused around capital formation. Honestly, that's sort of when you optimize something, you have to optimize around something, and we optimize around capital formation. So as you mentioned, we're scrappy, and so we want to get to the most significant first milestone with the minimum amount of capital possible. And there's a lot of tactics that go into that, but that's the strategy. And our first major milestone is our first launch, which we're about a year away from. And once that happens, we become $1 billion plus, unicorn in valuation. And capital is much easier to raise because it's a different tranche of capital. It becomes the growth capital. It becomes the people who are later stage. We'll have revenue by then. We've got a proven product and so forth. Not out of the woods by any means, but now capital becomes less expensive and it's more available. So you start to layer on some of the other things later. So we think of, in Phantom, we think of the launch vehicle as a bit of our foundation of the house, if you will, and that we build all these other business verticals on top of it. And so SpaceX has famously vertically integrated their technology. In other words, they build everything in-house. In fact, Elon one time asked me to see if we could put together a scandium mine so we could make scandium aluminum alloys, right? And that's how vertically integrated he thinks. I'm quite the opposite, right? But our products then become the vertical integration. So we'll build satellites. I was just on a call earlier this morning with a deal we're putting together where we're going to build their first couple of satellites, and then we'll assist them in raising more money. That money comes back to us, buys our launch vehicles. We build the satellites. So it's that kind of ecosystem we're trying to create, much like Apple. I'm a big fan of Apple, and I bought the first computer from Apple. I hated Apple for most of my life until I didn't. When I bought the first computer, I said, "Wow, this works great." Now I've got iPhones, iPads, watch, earbuds. I got everything from Apple, and so and I become very price insensitive, right? $300 for a set of earbuds. Oh yeah, that sounds fine. So I go and do it.
I know. Yeah. What's that? I live on them.
Right. $3,000 for a good computer. Oh yeah, well, I can buy a PC for $300. Okay, I just don't want it, and these last longer. So it's that ecosystem we're creating, and ultimately we'll build our own constellations like Starlink, not to compete with them, but that's the basic idea. Weather constellations, other communication constellations, at about half the capitalization of the rest of the industry. So that's how we'll dominate ultimately.
What needs to change? Because obviously we're in turmoil right now. We're sending, armaments all over. This kind of goes in the defense piece, but also in the aerospace piece. I would say the supply chain is probably very similar.
Yes.
What's going on with the aerospace and defense supply chain right now? And, what do we need to do to improve it?
So airline supply chain is sort of a proxy for where we're at. And if you look there, so the very large jumbos, those orders have gone away. And COVID really shocked the system. It shocked it from a number of points of view. In airlines, it was a little different than space and defense. We didn't have that demand drop. suddenly. So airlines are kind of like the poster child for how the supply chain is in trouble in this country. And, with the orders, and Boeing in particular puts in big orders and then rescinds them when they get to, actually doing it. But the companies that are supplying them have to think years ahead on materials, on staffing, on all the facilities, these things that are costing them dollars today that Boeing and Airbus and some of these others might not follow through on. Defense has been a little bit better that way because, again, you mentioned shooting wars, and, that's good for business when you're in defense, right? And I'm personally against all of this, but, it is good for business, and, the supply chain's doing okay. We're having an interesting phenomenon in the United States in space supply chain, in that a lot of these companies that create new products, that all of a sudden there's so much demand for them, they can't keep up with them. They're getting bought. They're getting bought by companies who want to internalize that supply chain, and they take the supply chain off the market. And that's even happening in Europe to some extent. And so there's this constant demand. And my advice to your investors is, if you want to invest in the space supply chain, you're going to do fine if you get a good team that can do something, and you're not as capital efficient as a mid-tier supplier like us. It's okay, and we just can't find enough parts. For example, valves. We can't get people to make our valves in enough time and at the right price, so we build them ourselves. I don't like doing it, but we have to. We're going to have to do the same thing with spacecraft components as we get into production on things. So that's really where the supply chain is, and that's different from where it was in 2000. There was a great supply chain when we started SpaceX, actually technically 2001, but it was very costly because it reflected the cost paradigm of the government business sector. And that's why SpaceX, if you wonder why they vertically integrate the tech, it was to control the costs. And that was very true back then. But there's a halo effect that's happened from SpaceX, which is very important to understand. Once people got their exits from SpaceX and left, and Elon's notoriously famous for burning people out, and he gets the most out of them, is the way I'd put it. They start their own businesses. So like our engine supplier is a major former SpaceX guys, and they built SpaceX engines, and now they're building them for us. So there's a nascent supply chain that's coming out of these successful entrepreneurial space companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, and that's a good thing.
What do you think about the consolidation or automation of the machining? Have you seen Hadrian?
Yeah.
For instance.
Yeah, I think some of these ideas are a little far-fetched for today, but in the long run, that's where it's going to go. So one of my I moved to Tucson about 15 years ago. 15 years ago, and one of the things I was surprised by was the amount of automation in manufacturing that I found here. And I have another business. I build race car parts, and I was able to have this all made very economically here in Tucson. I didn't have to deal with the Chinese stealing, my designs and selling them on eBay. And I think that revolution is just going to continue. One of the things people haven't begun to factor in is the effect of AI, and I think it's very nascent right now. The money, I think, has been placed in AI for that capability to develop, but its effect on the next level of manufacturing, on information management, on even enterprise management has yet to be seen. And it's going to do exactly what you say, which is to automate more and more of this sort of thing. So, at the end of the product, right, the machine tool still has to hit the metal and go around in circles and make holes and so on. But the more efficiently we can do that with less human touch labor, it's going to be faster, more quantity, and cheaper. So that's where this is all going. Space is starting to make that transition. That's one of the things we're trying to do at Phantom Space, is to bring that technology to bear on launch vehicles, on satellites, to bring the cost down, therefore making the access more widely available, less expensive, and more rapid.
Awesome. Jim, thank you so much for your time. I know that
My
you're
pleasure.
super busy. You're building rockets, right?
Yeah, so, in black.
In black. Thank you so much for coming on. Before we depart, some quick canned questions. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
Never, ever give up, ever.
I love it. And what is the best book you like to give out?
You know, besides my own Breaking All the Rules, I give a lot of those out. The best book I ever read, frankly, was Richard Bach's Illusions. And it's a story about a reluctant messiah. And he started out as an auto mechanic, and people found out he could fix them and fix their lives. And he got tired of fixing people's lives, and he just left. And he started flying a plane around the country, sort of randomly meeting people. It's a fantastic tale.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We drop an episode every week where we talk to the world's best entrepreneurs and founders and investors. If you like it, please subscribe, tell a friend, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Capital Stack Podcast. Make sure to share this with someone you know that can benefit from this content. Remember to support this show by rating, reviewing, and subscribing. David Paul is the founder and general partner at DWP Capital. All opinions expressed by David and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of DWP Capital. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for decisions. David and guests may maintain positions in the securities discussed on this podcast.